Good morning. Back at it again. Well, here we are. This is where we left it yesterday. The big chart, the people groups on the earth, 3 strands of the human family. If you grasp this, and there's quite a bit to it, but once you get the big flow, it's actually fairly simple. We're living at a time when there are unbelieving Jews, unbelieving Gentiles, and Christians on the earth. We've talked several times about the conflict between the offspring, between the spiritual seed of the woman and the spiritual seed of the serpent, as the conflict of the ages, Satan's war against God, plays itself out on the earth and in the heavenlies. So if you think about different aspects of the family, different sides of the family, you have Shem, descendant of Noah, son of Noah, will ultimately be set against his 2 brothers and their descendants. So the descendants of Ham became Egypt, and of course Egypt becomes a serious problem for Israel and for the rest of the world. And then Japheth, going to the north, we know that Gog of Magog, the region of Magog, will become play a part in the future, both in the Ezekiel 38-39 war, and then after Satan is released, the region is mentioned again at the end of the book of Revelation. So there's conflict between the offspring. So Satan foments this conflict within the family. Then if you think about Abraham, a descendant of Shem, he comes out of the region of Babylon, which is where they had gathered together with one world government, one world religion, under one world leader. And there the languages were divided, and Abraham came out of that region. Some suppose that perhaps Abraham spoke the original language, his language stayed the same. Perhaps it was Hebrew. Some think that it was, or an early form of Hebrew. So obviously there's going to be conflict between Abraham and his predecessors in his old homeland of Babylon. And then we think about Moab and Ammon. Abraham had a nephew whose name was Lot, and Lot had 2 sons, and their names were Moab and Ammon. And when you come to 1 Kings 11, we talked about Solomon having 700 wives and 300 mistresses, and he worshiped the gods of the Ammonites and the Moabites, Chemosh and Molech. And what was involved with that sacrifice to those gods was child sacrifice as part of their worship. And we'll talk about that more later. Then you have Isaac and his half-brother Ishmael. From Ishmael, there were 12 princes of Arabia. And out of Arabia in the 700s A.D., in the 8th century A.D., or the 7th century A.D., in the 600s, is where the nation, or where the religion of Islam began under Muhammad. And obviously, Arabia and those who are influenced by the religion of Islam have set themselves against the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you have Jacob and his 12 sons to form the nation of Israel. So it's not all of the descendants of Abraham, not all the descendants of Isaac, but it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his 12 sons. And his brother Esau, who is also known as Edom. Jump ahead 2,000 years, and there is going to be a problem at the time that the Messiah is born. If you can kill these lights, if you do, it's the other way. Yeah. There you go. So jump ahead 2,000 years to the birth of the Messiah. The Roman Empire is ruling, and there is a puppet king, the king of the Jews, a puppet king in Israel. And he now has a rival who has been born king of the Jews. And so he issues a decree for all the male children under 2 years old to be killed. Do you happen to remember the ethnicity of King Herod? He was an Edomite. He was an Edomite. The whole prophecy of Obadiah is against the Edomites. Edomites' destruction is prophesied. So this continues to be a problem even to today. Now we jump ahead through the through the Egyptian time in Egypt, coming to the first era, the era of Moses, his first 40 years in Egypt. You know the story well, the account well. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already, having been sold into slavery by his brothers. Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased, abundantly multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. And there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, was not aware of Joseph. Joseph had saved not only his own people from the famine, from the 7 years of famine, but he had saved the entire Egyptian empire because God had given him the dreams and the wisdom to know how to save up the crops so that they were able to survive the 7 years of famine. And so here you have an Israelite who is elevated to one of the highest positions in the Egyptian empire. But after several generations, a new king, a new Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph, but his family and his nation was very difficult to ignore because God had allowed them to grow in essentially what was this hothouse, literally, but in this hothouse of Egypt, under the protection of the Egyptian empire, the most powerful empire in the world, protected from their enemies, brought under their wings. But they go from being in a position of favor to being a position of servitude. And so with this later generation, hundreds of years later, the attitude toward them changed as the nation of Israel continued to grow, and they said, "Let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go out of the land." Well, had you not made them slaves and made them partners instead, you probably wouldn't have this problem. But now they have been mistreating the Israelites, and so now they become an internal existential threat to the Egyptian empire. But God continued to bless, even though they set taskmasters over them to afflict them. They treated them more and more harshly, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, verse 12, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So you have the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful army in the world, the richest nation in the world, the most influential nation, now has a problem in their midst as they have allowed a nation to grow. To this point, if you come to the time of if you look at the counts, the number of people of fighting age who went out of Egypt at the Exodus, you're around 630,000 people of fighting age, those 20 years and older. Just conservative math, with a woman and 2 children per man of fighting age, that easily puts you at well over 2 million people that have grown inside, and they present a threat. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with vigor. And so they devise a plan where they are going to prevent the birth of male children. You know the story well. When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. So they have population control and infanticide, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the midwives took their own lives, put their own lives at risk to not follow through. And then, of course, this one woman who was of the house of Levi conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what had been done to him. Pharaoh's daughter would go down to the Nile to bathe. So Pharaoh's daughter said to her, she had found this child. She said, so the maiden went and called the child's mother. So his sister obviously had been watching this, and when Pharaoh's daughter had found him, she said, I know a lady who is nursing, and she will be able to wean this child. So Pharaoh's daughter said, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So she took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So this Hebrew, once again, is brought into the royal household. He is made a grandson, an adopted grandson of Pharaoh, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he is essentially then becoming a prince of Egypt. Joseph had essentially become a prince of Egypt. And now you have another man who has been adopted even more formally into the Egyptian household. And at this point in time, Israel has gone from a position of favor to a position of servitude. The children of Israel are now slaves in Egypt, and the worship of Israel's God is forbidden. So when God's chosen people have now become slaves of a pagan nation, and that nation refuses to allow Israel to worship their own God, is this going to end well? This kind of thing does not end well. So we are moving with regard to a specific nation. Up till now it's been with regard to the world's population. Now with regard to a specific nation that has enslaved the nation of Israel, God's judgment is going to fall. We've reached a point of we're almost there to the point of no return. So the second era of Moses, at the age of 40 years old, he's grown up in Pharaoh's household, had all the advantages and privileges. Apparently he had learned to write during that time. He was able to teach the children of Israel to write, and when they came out of the wilderness, to read and to write. So he was very skilled, and he had received the best education, but he had to flee. As you remember the account, Moses went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. Now, Moses knew that he wasn't an Egyptian. He knew that he was ethnically not an Egyptian. Physically, he would have looked somewhat different than the Egyptians. He knew he wasn't an Egyptian. He went out to his people. He knew who his people were. The Egyptians knew he wasn't an Egyptian. He went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, if you had had an Egyptian prince go out and see a low-level foreman beating a slave, would that have, and that prince had killed that low-level foreman, would that have caused a problem? Should not have caused a problem. For an Egyptian prince to go out and kill a low-level worker, that should not have caused a problem. But it did cause a problem because everybody knew that he wasn't an Egyptian. So he goes out the next day, and there were two Hebrew men fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, "Why are you striking your companion?" Then they said, Who made you a prince and judge over us? Well, the Pharaoh had made him a prince and judge over them, but they knew that he wasn't an Egyptian. So they are challenging him. They're saying, who are you to try to tell us? You're no different than we are. And so at that point, they say, do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptians? So what had happened? It had become known throughout the Hebrew community that this prince of Egypt, Moses, a Hebrew, had killed an Egyptian. This is not a good thing. So now Moses knows that his life, he's a walking dead man. So he has to flee. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And he's going to be there for 40 years. And this brings us to the point, the threshold of this dispensational change. So Moses is now 80 years old, and God is going to appear to him, and Moses is going to enter into a brand new phase of his life at 80 years old, as God is about ready to bring judgment against the Egyptian empire. So this brings us to the era of Moses, his third 40 years, from Midian back to Egypt, and then from Egypt up to the border of the Promised Land on the east side of the Jordan River.
Moses. Moses. I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. I have heard the cry of my people Israel. I will send you to the Pharaoh, and you shall free my people from Egypt.
They won't believe me now. Ask, what is his name?
I am who I am.
I am Moses. I come only because the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob asked me to speak his message.
The God of Israel has shown himself to us. And these are his words. It says, "Let my people go, so they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness."
The Lord God of Israel bids you, let his people go.
No one bids great Egypt, God on earth, anything. Hear now the voice of the Lord God of Israel. He bids you let these people go.
Blood. Blood. There will be blood throughout the whole of Egypt for 7 days. The fish will die. The rivers will stink of death.
Moses, all your tricks will not convince me to release Egypt's workforce.
It is God's will that you let his people go.
Send everything you have in an open field to a secure place. Every human and every animal will die. And the hail comes.
just a terrible price of freedom.
Take some of the lamb's blood and put it on the doorposts of your houses. The lamb's blood will be a sign. When the Lord sees the blood, he will pass over you.
Death to any man who disobeys! Forward!
And so the Egyptian Empire goes from being the most powerful nation on the earth to losing all its riches, losing all of its power, its military might. It never recovers to the degree that of its fame and power that it had at that time. Start with the call of Moses. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. And of course, the angel of the Lord is a pre-incarnate appearance of the eternal Son of God. When you see capital L, small caps O-R-D, that is a translation of the Hebrew word Yahweh. If you see capital L and small lowercase O-R-D, that is Adonai, which means like Sir or Lord. But this represents the personal name of the Lord. So he appeared to Moses. He says, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon him. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel, remember, this has been 40 years. There's a whole generation who doesn't even know who he is. When I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. They said, Yahweh is my name. Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Obviously, this has significance in the New Testament. Jesus was in one of his many confrontations with the Pharisees and had to do with him challenging them. They said in verse 52 of John chapter 8, we know that you have a demon. Abraham is dead, and the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death. So this is a debate about the resurrection and life after death. And they said, are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead, and the prophets who are dead? Who do you make yourself out to be? And then he says in verse 56, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. Rejoiced to see the day that was coming, the time when the Messiah would be the deliverer for the people of Israel. He rejoiced to see my day, and he saw and was glad. And the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham. And Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, Jesus very likely said this in Aramaic, but it's a sister language to Hebrew, so whether he said it in Hebrew for effect or whether he said it in Aramaic, they clearly, to their ear, they knew exactly what he was saying. Their mind would have immediately gone to what God said to Moses in the burning bush, that he was claiming to be the person who spoke to Moses in the burning bush. And we know that this is what they thought because of their reaction. They took up stones to throw at him. So they were going to execute him for blasphemy for his identification as the God of Israel. So if anybody ever says that Jesus never claimed to be God, that's a bogus claim. He very clearly did here. He identifies himself as the angel of the Lord and the Lord himself. You have the 10 plagues that God sends against Egypt. Each of the plagues is sent against one of the major local deities of the Egyptians to demonstrate that the God of Israel is greater than any of the deities of Egypt, with the death of the firstborn being the final one. This would be the firstborn of in any family, no matter how old they were. A firstborn who is 1 year old or a firstborn who is 50 years old, all of the firstborn died. So Ra, the Pharaoh, was considered an incarnation of the sun god Ra, one of the most powerful of the Egyptian deities. And so he would have lost his eldest son as well. And it's as a result of that last plague that he tells Israel to get out. And the Egyptians are pleading with them that he go out. So the Lord devises this plan that will become one of the feasts of the Lord that are instituted, a perpetual feast to be observed. The Hebrew calendar changes. It shifts by 6 months in Exodus 12. So if you're familiar with the Hebrew calendar, you're familiar with the idea that there are 2 New Years. You have a New Year in the fall with the Feast of Trumpets. And in that month, the 10th day of the month is the Day of Atonement. So that is that was the New Year, beginning with that month. But God now moved it. So that remained the civil calendar, but God created a new calendar 6 months earlier that became the religious calendar. And so in the 10th day of this month is when they would take a lamb, and on the 14th day is when they would slaughter the lamb, and that would be the Passover. So there were 7 feasts in Israel. You have the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits. Those are the spring feasts. And you have the Feast of Pentecost in late spring, early summer. And then in the fall, you have the Feast of Trumpets, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. Tabernacles is a reminder of the time in the wilderness. And Hebrew men from all over the world were required to go up to Jerusalem. As time went by, they were to gather together to celebrate 3 of those 7 feasts: Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which is why in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, you have Jews from all over the known world. The majority of them, especially those from great distances, had been there from the Feast of Passover, because it would have taken too long during that 50 days to come back and get back for the Feast of Pentecost. So this becomes the beginning of months for them. We read in 1 Corinthians 5 that Paul makes the identification that the Passover becomes a picture of Christ. And many things that happened, the feasts become pictures of Christ. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, "Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. For indeed Christ, our sacrifice, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us." So symbolically, the angel of death, when he passed through Egypt, when he saw the blood on the doorposts, the blood of the sacrifice on the doorposts, he would pass over, and death would not be visited upon that household. In the same way, Christ has become our Passover, so that when God sees us, he sees us not in our own deadness in our own works and our filthy rags, which our works are nothing more than filthy rags, but rather he sees us through the blood of the sacrifice. And so in that way, Christ becomes our Passover. Then the exodus out of Egypt. The Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So you have over 600,000 men of fighting age, 20 years and above, plus women and children and those who were older. Can you imagine how much gold, silver, precious stones, food, livestock could be taken out of Egypt by a group of people of that size? That's a massive amount of people. And the Egyptians were glad to give it to them just to get them out of the land after these 10 plagues. So just get out and leave. And then, of course, Pharaoh has a change of heart at the last minute, and they end up losing not only all of their wealth, their economy is destroyed, but their military might is destroyed in a moment of time. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Not so much as one of them remained. So it's kind of hard to maintain your position as a world power if your economy has collapsed and you have no army. Kind of hard to hold on to that position. Which brings us to the next dispensation, the dispensation of the law, from Exodus 19 through Acts chapter 1, with the church being born in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. So in the Bible, this makes up a large section of Scripture. The Mosaic covenant is different than the Abrahamic covenant. It is a bilateral, temporary covenant.
Good. Now that you're free man, you may rest. Every seventh day. This will be the Sabbath, and you will not have to work.
The Sabbath?
No work.
What's the Sabbath?
No work on the Sabbath.
How can we?
You rest.
What does it mean?
God says, there is no work on the Sabbath. You will rest. You will not gather the manna on that day, but on the sixth day you will take a double ration, which will not rot. Mount Sinai, where God first spoke to me.
In the burning bush.
God is calling me up there.
God says to you, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians. I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. If you will be faithful to me and heed my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession amongst all peoples. God says to you, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Israel! Hear the word of the Lord! The Lord has spoken and said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of bondage. You will have no other gods besides me. You will make no enemies, no bow down, no worship any idol. The Lord has spoken.
don't even know what has become of him. Let us find our own way of seeking God. Fashion our own tribute to God. We will fashion his image with our own hands so that we can see him, touch him.
You heard the voice of the Lord yourself.
He commanded us to have no idols.
Not an idol, Aaron, a tribute. Fashioned from the best gold, the best precious metals, the best gems we possess. It can be our guide out of this wilderness.
Blessed be this symbol of the great force that led us out of Egypt. We consecrate your image and ask that you be with us now.
Greet the birth of this image of the Almighty. Celebrate its presence in our midst. Celebrate! Is this how you serve God in my absence? The word of the Lord! The hand of God! Apart to Egypt and in the wilderness! Look around! Ha! No, Moses!
So before the law can even be delivered, they've already broken the first two commandments. And from the way the text reads, you get the impression that when God spoke from the mountain through the thunderings, that he spoke in such a way that the entire nation heard the Ten Commandments being given. And then then Moses went up to receive the remainder of the law. So they immediately broke. They were right out of Egypt. They were a redeemed people, and the first thing they did was what would characterize the next 1,000 years of their existence, and that was the worship of idols. And this was an Egyptian idol. So we think about persecution. Sometimes you hear about persecution. People talk about persecution being the blood of the martyrs being the seed of the church, and persecution bringing purification. That's really not always the case. Persecution generally results in compromise for all but a few. You saw that with communism as well. Wherever there's persecution, that is true that God always has his people. But persecution does have negative effects. So you have the Mosaic covenant, which is different than the Abrahamic covenant, different than the Noahic covenant. It is a temporary as opposed to eternal, bilateral as opposed to unilateral, one-sided, conditional covenant with the redeemed people. So conditional covenant, God says, you do this and I will do this. You don't do this and I will do this. So the fulfillment depends upon the faithfulness of both parties. God says in Exodus 19, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this is a foreshadow of what Israel's role will be in the kingdom once it's established. Remember, God is going somewhere with history. It's to establish a kingdom of righteousness. There is to be a theocratic kingdom on the earth, and Israel has a function in that kingdom. The church is unseen at this point. The church is not revealed until you get to the New Testament. It's a mystery that is hidden in the Old Testament, revealed in the New. But Israel has a very definite, a very specific role in the future theocratic kingdom. God says, you shall have no other gods before me, and that becomes the sticking point for the next 1,000 years, breaking the first commandment. Now, sometimes dispensationalists, in my view, some dispensationalists overstate the case when it comes to the fact that They were under law, but we are under grace. Therefore, we are not bound to things related to the law or the Sermon on the Mount. And you'll hear certain dispensationalists, I would say, again, overstate the case in order to make the point. And it leads to some confusion, I think. For one thing, it leads to a charge against dispensationalists by non-dispensationalists that we are antinomian or we are lawless, because we don't want to have, we say that we're not under the law. We are not under the law, but then the Gentiles were never under the law anyway. It was the nation of Israel. Secondly, there are aspects there were aspects of law in general that were incorporated into the law of Moses, but which transcend the law of Moses. And here's what I mean. Here you have the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Then you make no idols, and it goes on. You'll not murder, you'll not steal, you're to be obedient to parents. Now, is this the first time in history when this became true? In other words, before God actually said this explicitly, was it okay to worship other gods, to make idols, to be disobedient, to commit adultery, to steal, to murder? No, it was not okay. Because these are rooted in the moral character of God. These transcend the law, but these moral aspects of God's nature are incorporated into the law and become the letter of the law. But it was always, these were always sin it was always a sin to worship other gods. Now we are past the cross. Christ said, "It is finished." The entire price has been paid for all of our sins, past, present, and future. So now that we're past the cross and we're living in the quote-unquote age of grace, is it now okay to worship other gods, to make idols, to lie, cheat, steal, commit adultery, and murder people? Is it okay? No. So why? Because these things are transcendent. They transcend dispensations because they are rooted in the moral character of God. And some dispensationalists overstate their case to the point where they almost make the Old Testament sound irrelevant. They even make the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospel sound irrelevant, that we shouldn't be preaching from these because the Gospels were to Israel. But there are principles rooted in the character of God, not the letter of the law. We can eat pork and we don't have to, we're not taking sacrifices as part of our worship system or to deal with sin or for fellowship with God, but there are moral aspects of the law that are transcendent and go across dispensations. So and this is an area where we get attacked a lot. One of the functions of the law, being in the letter of the law, Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law, kept for the faith which would afterward be revealed. Therefore, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ. So it's like you have someone who is a nanny, for example, or someone who is tutoring your child. If you have a royal household, you have somebody who's responsible for tutoring your child, teaching them all the things that they need to learn when they're growing up. If you have more money than you know what to do with, and you're shirking your responsibility as a parent, but you have someone who's basically raising your children, taking them by the hand and leading them in the way that they should go. This is what the law does. And what you find is that in an attempt to keep the law, you find that it's impossible to keep perfectly. And as James says in chapter 2, if you fail to keep the law in any point, you are guilty of what? Breaking the entire thing. So there has to be another solution. This is why salvation could never be by works. There are some dispensationalists who put the start of the church after Acts chapter 2, and I don't have time to get into it, but there's a minority of dispensationalists who do say that Jews were saved through obedience to the law and to the degree that they were obedient to the law. That is simply not true. That is destroyed by Paul in Romans. No one is ever saved through the works of the law. But that group is in a fairly small minority. The tabernacle and the furnishings, this is a foreshadow of the tabernacle in heaven. This is a temporary shelter and a temporary dwelling place for God. The ultimate permanent dwelling place for God will be on the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, which is understood to be the place where Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac. According to the rabbis, and I don't put a lot of stock in what the rabbis say, but I'm just throwing this out there, that according to rabbinic tradition, the holy mountain of God, the place of Mount Moriah, and the place where the Holy of Holies stood once the temple was built there, Solomon's temple was built there, there is a rock, and over that rock right now is a dome, an Islamic dome that was erected, the Dome of the Rock. And according to rabbinic tradition, that stone is the foundation stone of the earth, and that is where Adam and Eve were created. I have no idea. There's no way to know, but this is according to rabbinic tradition. So there are furnishings. This becomes God's portable throne room. And there are furnishings and different aspects of it point and are foreshadows of Christ. Point to and are foreshadows of Christ. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, on the first day, on the first day of the first month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. So they would have 1 year to put together all the materials that they would need. And had things gone the way they should have, this temple or this tabernacle would have been originally erected in the Promised Land. It was first put up a year later, but they had failed to go into the Promised Land because of their disobedience. So now it's going to be erected in the wilderness. Thus Moses did according to all that the Lord had commanded, so he did, and it came to pass in the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month. So again, calendar moved to the spring, 6 months earlier. The first day of the month that the tabernacle was raised up. On the 10th day of the month, the lamb is selected. The Passover lamb is selected. On the 14th day of the month, the Passover lamb is sacrificed. Then the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tabernacle of meeting because the cloud rested above it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So what has happened? The God of the universe has now invaded the realm of the God of this world. He has now set up his own place of worship, not a mountain built with human hands, but a place of his own design, and a place where he would be among his people as they moved around in the wilderness until the permanent temple would be built on Mount Moriah. So God is present among his people. Imagine waking up every morning, and here in the courtyard you see this pillar of cloud, and at night there is a little fire out there at night. I think the pillar of fire is probably a little bit bigger than this little pillar of fire out here. But imagine that, and you know that every time that you come out in the morning, you are in the presence of God. And we think, wouldn't that affect the way that we live? You would like to think that would affect the way you live, right? To have the presence of God so close. But what do we do about the presence of God who lives within us? And we are the temple. We kind of get used to it after a while, don't we? Yeah. And ever notice how the difference between somebody who has just gotten saved and somebody who's been saved for 30 years? There's something unique about someone their thinking, their attitude, the freshness of what it means to be indwelt by the living God and to have a whole new way of thinking. Everything's like brand new. It's like a kid in a candy store, isn't it? Reading the Bible for the first time and making all these discoveries, and then pretty soon it's like, it's like a spoiled kid who gets to go to Kids R Us before they close down. He gets to go through Kids R Us every day. It kind of becomes old hat, doesn't it? And then you have the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant holds Aaron's rod that budded, a jar of the manna that God used to preserve them in the wilderness, and the stones of the tablet. Now, the top of the Ark of the Covenant had a name. What was the name of the top of the Ark of the Covenant? The mercy seat. Why was it called the mercy seat? Why was the top of this box called a seat? That's where we'll pick up after the break.